Right now, as you watch this video, something extraordinary is happening in Central Asia that has quietly dismantled one of the most powerful leverage points in global energy politics. For decades, Iran has held a strategic chokehold on the world's oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage through which roughly 20% of the world's oil flows every single day. That chokehold just experienced a critical crack. A new 1,300-kilometer transportation corridor connecting Iran to new markets across Eurasia has emerged as a fully operational alternative route, and this changes everything you thought you knew about energy security, Middle Eastern power dynamics, and the silent war being fought over your gas prices at the pump. If you have ever wondered why oil prices spike whenever tensions rise in the Persian Gulf, this story explains it in a way that will permanently change how you see the evening news. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Oman and Iran, and at its narrowest point, the shipping lane is only about 3 kilometers wide. Imagine trying to drive a massive supertanker through a lane narrower than a highway on-ramp, and you begin to understand why this passage is so vulnerable. This makes it incredibly easy to block or disrupt entirely. Iran has long used this vulnerability as its ultimate card to play whenever facing international pressure. Threaten their economy with sanctions, and Iran would hint at closing the strait. The world would flinch. Sanctions would soften. Negotiations would open. This was Iran's ace in the hole, and it worked brilliantly for more than 40 years. But a single corridor has now altered that calculation permanently, and the implications reach far beyond geopolitics into your daily life, your commute, and your family budget. Here is what you need to understand by the end of this video, and I promise you it will be worth your time. The corridor I am referring to is called the International North-South Transport Corridor, or INSTC for short, a multimodal trade route stretching approximately 1,300 kilometers that connects the ports of the Caspian Sea to Iranian railways, and eventually to European markets. The INSTC is not a new idea. Talks about creating such a route have been circulating since the early 2000s, and more than a dozen countries have signed on to various agreements related to its development. But here's what changed recently that made this corridor suddenly matter in a way it never has before. India, Russia, and Iran completed a series of long-delayed rail and port connections that brought the corridor from theoretical possibility to operational reality. Cargo trains are now moving goods from Mumbai to Moscow using this route. Iranian ports are handling shipments that previously would have required passage through the Strait of Hormuz entirely. The numbers are still relatively modest compared to total global trade, but the strategic signal is enormous, and strategic signals are often more powerful than raw statistics in shaping how nations behave. Why does this matter so much for Hormuz? Because every container of goods, every barrel of oil, every shipment of commodities that can reach its destination without passing through that narrow strait represents a reduction in the leverage Iran derives from controlling one of the world's most critical choke points. When countries know they have alternatives, Iran's threats carry less weight. When Europe and India can diversify their supply chains, the weaponization of the strait becomes less effective as a negotiating tool. This is not about replacing Hormuz entirely. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. The strait will remain vital for decades. This is about creating a buffer, a backup route, a strategic hedge that reduces the catastrophic impact of a potential blockage. And in geopolitics, having alternatives is everything. It is the difference between holding a hand of cards with one wild card versus holding a hand where you have multiple viable options to play. Now let us go deeper into what is really driving this development, because the story is more complex and more interesting than just a new trade route appearing on a map. The INSTC has been in various stages of development for 2 decades, but 3 forces converged recently to make it suddenly operational in ways that caught many analysts by surprise. First, Western sanctions on Russia following the conflict in Ukraine pushed Moscow to seek alternative trade routes that bypassed Western-controlled payment systems and shipping lanes. Russia needed the INSTC not as a preference, but as a survival mechanism. When your traditional trade routes become suddenly hostile territory, you adapt or you collapse, and Russia chose to adapt. Second, India saw an opportunity to expand its economic influence in Central Asia while reducing its dependency on routes through Pakistan or through waters controlled by China's navy. India has long dreamed of being a major regional power, and the INSTC gives New Delhi a concrete way to project economic influence westward. Third, Iran, desperate for economic lifelines after years of heavy sanctions, saw the INSTC as a way to position itself as a transit hub rather than a pariah state. These 3 interests aligned at precisely the right moment, and suddenly the corridor that had existed only on planning documents and diplomatic memos became a living, breathing trade artery that is reshaping how goods move across continents. The numbers tell a story of rapid acceleration that should catch everyone's attention. In 2021, total cargo shipped through the INSTC measured in the hundreds of thousands of tons, a figure so small it barely registered in global trade statistics. By 2023, that figure had jumped to over 17 million tons, according to reports from the Caspian Policy Center and various freight industry analyses. That represents an increase of more than 4,000% in just 2 years, and the trajectory continues upward. A single container shipping from India to Russia via the traditional route through the Suez Canal and Mediterranean takes about 25 to 35 days, depending on weather and port congestion. The same container via the INSTC takes about 14 to 20 days, and crucially, it avoids the Suez Canal fees that can run into hundreds of thousands of dollars per transit, the piracy concerns in the Gulf of Aden that require expensive security measures, and the potential for delays caused by regional conflicts that can shut down traditional routes without warning. For time-sensitive goods like pharmaceuticals, electronics, and high-value manufacturers, these savings in time and money are transformative and can mean the difference between profit and loss for entire companies. If you are finding this breakdown useful, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We track these developments in real time, and the next update on this corridor could change the entire picture of global trade as we know it. Now let us go deeper into what this means for the balance of power in the Middle East and beyond. The Strait of Hormuz has been described by military analysts as one of the most strategically vulnerable points on the entire planet. Imagine a hallway that is only 3 kilometers wide, and every day, tankers carrying oil worth millions of dollars pass through single file like cars in a parking garage with no exit. One country, Iran, sits on both sides of that hallway at its narrowest point, giving Tehran a geographic gift that no amount of military spending could replicate. For decades, Iran understood that if it ever truly threatened to close that passage, the global economy would panic in a way that would make 2008 look like a gentle correction. Oil prices would surge by double digits overnight. Industrial nations would pressure their governments to negotiate. Iran could extract concessions simply by making the threat without ever having to follow through. This dynamic gave Iran disproportionate influence in international affairs, far beyond what its raw economic or military power would normally warrant. Smaller nations rarely get to punch above their weight class in geopolitics, but Iran found a loophole, and it exploited that loophole masterfully for 4 decades. But what happens when countries can route their trade around that hallway entirely? The leverage shrinks. Not to zero, not yet, and the people who claim Hormuz is now irrelevant are dramatically oversimplifying a complex situation. But enough to fundamentally change the calculus, yes, definitely. When India announced it was increasing INSTC shipments substantially, Iranian officials welcomed the development publicly while privately acknowledging the strategic shift occurring around them. Russia, meanwhile, has been transparent about its interest in reducing dependence on any choke point controlled by potential adversaries, and that includes the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and yes, the Strait of Hormuz. Europe, still cautious about direct involvement due to concerns about antagonizing the United States and disrupting long-standing alliances, has nonetheless been watching the corridor's development with keen interest, because any diversification of energy routes reduces vulnerability to supply shocks that can devastate their economies and political stability. Consider what this means in practical terms for ordinary people like you and me. Every time oil prices spike because of Middle Eastern tensions, the ripple effects reach your local gas station within weeks, sometimes within days. Heating costs rise. Transportation expenses climb. Airlines adjust ticket prices. Manufacturers pass on higher input costs through price increases on everything from electronics to furniture to the plastic containers holding your groceries. The average American family spends thousands of dollars more per year during periods of oil price spikes, money that could have gone to savings, education, or quality of life improvements. When alternative routes exist and are functioning properly, the spikes become smaller and shorter because supply disruptions matter less when goods can flow through multiple channels. The INSTC will not eliminate your exposure to oil price volatility entirely, but it introduces a new variable that reduces the automatic panic response that follows any threat to the Hormuz passage. That is a meaningful improvement in stability for millions of working families around the world. But here is the twist that most coverage of this story misses, and it is a twist that reveals how much more complex geopolitics is than simple headlines suggest. Iran's response to the emergence of the INSTC has not been resistance or hostility, as you might expect from a nation losing its primary leverage point. Instead, Iran has aggressively pursued a strategy of becoming the corridor's linchpin, its indispensable center. Tehran understands that if it cannot be the gatekeeper of the Hormuz Strait in the same way it used to be, it can instead become the essential transit hub for a new Silk Road connecting Asia and Europe. Iran has invested heavily in upgrading its rail connections, port facilities, and customs procedures to handle increased traffic efficiently. Iranian officials have publicly stated that they view the NSTC as a transformational opportunity to reposition the country from a regional pariah to an indispensable logistics node connecting civilizations. This is a remarkable strategic pivot from a nation that, for years, relied on the threat of disrupting global trade rather than participating in it as a partner. It shows that even countries facing severe international pressure can adapt, innovate, and find new paths to relevance and power. What does this mean for the broader Middle East and the global balance of power? It means that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and other Gulf states are watching very carefully indeed. If Iran successfully transforms itself into a major transit hub connecting Asia and Europe, it gains economic benefits that could stabilize its government, fund its military programs, reduce the effectiveness of international sanctions, and fundamentally alter its position in regional negotiations. This is not necessarily good or bad, depending on your perspective and which nation you call home, but it represents a profound shift in regional dynamics that will reshape alliances, trade relationships, and military calculations for years to come. Countries that have relied on their geographic position near Hormuz for strategic leverage may find that advantage eroding as alternatives multiply and as Iran's economic position strengthens through its new transit role. The Middle East chessboard is being rearranged, and not everyone will end up in the same position they started. The NSTC is not the only corridor in development, and understanding this competitive landscape is essential to grasping the full picture. China's Belt and Road Initiative has created competing routes through Pakistan, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, each with its own strategic advantages and political implications. The Trans-Caspian route connecting China to Europe through Kazakhstan, the Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and eventually Turkey offers another alternative that competes directly with the INSTC for traffic and influence. Each new route that becomes operational reduces the relative importance of the Persian Gulf corridor, and this proliferation of alternatives is precisely why the geopolitical calculus is shifting in ways that favor diversification and redundancy over dependence on any single choke point. The era of single-point vulnerabilities being used as strategic leverage is gradually giving way to a new era of interconnected routes and backup systems that make sudden disruptions less catastrophic and less exploitable. Now consider what would happen if the current trajectory continues for the next 5 years without major interruption. INSTC volumes could increase substantially as more countries formally join the agreement, as infrastructure improvements speed transit times, and as more companies discover the cost advantages of the route. Russia has already diverted significant trade through the corridor, reducing its exposure to sanctions-related disruptions on traditional routes. India has announced plans to dramatically increase shipments, with New Delhi seeing the corridor as essential to its ambitions of becoming a major global trade hub, rather than merely a regional player. Iran is building new port infrastructure to handle increasing volumes, and the construction cranes working on those facilities represent a physical manifestation of geopolitical transformation. Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan have invested in rail improvements that speed cargo movements and reduce bottlenecks that currently slow the corridor's full potential. If INSTC trade reaches even 50 million tons annually within 5 years, that represents a meaningful chunk of goods that no longer depend on Hormuz passage, and the psychological impact of that shift on oil markets and investor confidence alone could be transformative in ways that exceed the pure arithmetic of trade volumes. But what about worst-case scenarios that we must consider if we are being intellectually honest? What if tensions escalate and someone actually attempts to disrupt the corridor? The NSTC passes through multiple countries, each with its own security concerns, internal politics, and potential for instability that could interrupt the flow of goods. Russia and Iran face international isolation that creates unpredictable political dynamics. Azerbaijan and Armenia have unresolved territorial disputes that have already produced conflict and could produce more. Kazakhstan has managed its relationships carefully to avoid antagonizing both Russia and the West simultaneously, but that balancing act becomes more difficult as geopolitical tensions increase. Any major conflict involving these countries could interrupt the corridor and erase its strategic benefits potentially for years. The corridor is not a magic bullet that eliminates all risk. It is a hedge, a buffer, a diversification tool that reduces but does not eliminate vulnerability to disruption. Those who treat it as a complete solution are making the same mistake that those who ignored it entirely made years ago. The truth lies in understanding both its potential and its limitations. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Iran will successfully transform itself into a transit hub that reshapes its international position? Or will internal instability, economic pressures, and international pressure prevent that pivot from succeeding? Your perspective helps us all understand this faster, and the diversity of viewpoints in our community often reveals angles that no single analyst can see alone. While you are thinking about that, consider this next piece of the puzzle that most people never even consider. What most people miss about the ANSTC is that it represents something even bigger than a trade route or a geopolitical lever. It represents the emergence of a new geopolitical architecture in which the old rules of leverage and choke point control are being quietly but fundamentally rewritten. For decades, control over critical geographic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and the Strait of Malacca gave countries extraordinary power to disrupt global commerce and extract political concessions from dependent nations. That power is not disappearing overnight, and those who claim we have entered a post-choke point era are dramatically overstating the case. But it is being diluted by new infrastructure, new partnerships, and new trade relationships that create redundancy where none previously existed. The world is becoming more resilient, more interconnected, and less dependent on any single point of potential failure. And this shift has profound implications for how nations negotiate, how wars are fought, and how ordinary people experience the global economy. This matters because it signals a broader shift in how global power works in the 21st century. The United States has long relied on its naval dominance to keep shipping lanes open and to ensure that global commerce flows without major disruption, and that dominance remains significant and worth maintaining. But as corridors like the INSTC proliferate and as digital commerce becomes increasingly important relative to physical goods, the premium on traditional naval control decreases somewhat, though never entirely. Countries gain more agency through infrastructure investment and diplomatic partnerships than through military control of sea lanes. And this shift rewards different kinds of investments and capabilities than the Cold War era emphasized. This does not mean military power is irrelevant or that navies will become obsolete. It means that economic connectivity and infrastructure development are increasingly the foundations of strategic influence, and nations that invest in trade routes, port facilities, and diplomatic relationships are building power that complements, and in some contexts, exceeds traditional military capabilities. For you personally, what does all of this mean in practical terms? It means that the next time you hear about tensions in the Middle East causing oil price spikes, you should watch whether alternative routes are functioning as a measure of how severe the impact might be. If the INSTC and other corridors are operating smoothly, the spike may be shorter and shallower than historical patterns would suggest, and your gas prices might return to normal faster than past experience would predict. If those corridors face disruptions from conflict, weather, or political decisions, the old patterns reassert themselves and the spikes become more severe and longer lasting. Understanding these dynamics gives you a more nuanced view of global events and their practical impact on your daily life, your investment decisions, and your understanding of international affairs. You become a more informed citizen, a more thoughtful consumer, and someone who can see beneath the surface of daily headlines to understand the deeper forces shaping our world. Now let us talk about what to watch for in the coming weeks and months as this story continues to develop. Here are 3 specific indicators that will tell you whether this shift is accelerating or stalling, and paying attention to these indicators will give you an edge in understanding global developments before they become obvious to the general public. First, watch for announcements of new rail connections or port upgrades in Iran, Azerbaijan, or Kazakhstan. Infrastructure investment signals long-term commitment to the corridor and the kind of institutional persistence that outlasts any single political administration or temporary crisis. Second, watch for shifts in trade statistics, particularly increases in cargo volumes between India and Russia or between Central Asia and Europe. Numbers do not lie, and sustained growth in these statistics tells you that the corridor is becoming a permanent feature of the global trade landscape, rather than a temporary phenomenon. Third, watch for diplomatic signals from major powers about their official posture toward the corridor. Support from China, Russia, and India gives the INSTC credibility and political cover that attracts additional participants. Opposition or neutrality from the United States and European powers shapes the corridor's room to grow, and determines whether it remains a niche route or becomes a mainstream option for global shippers. As this story develops in the coming months and years, we will be tracking each of these indicators and bringing you updates that connect the dots between infrastructure developments and geopolitical consequences. The Middle East did not change overnight in the dramatic, explosive sense that headline writers love and that generates clicks and views. It changed quietly through the steady accumulation of rail ties completed, port facilities upgraded, and diplomatic commitments signed that now allow goods to flow around a choke point that once seemed irreplaceable in global commerce. Iran still holds significant leverage through its control of the Hormuz Strait's geography, but that leverage is no longer absolute and can no longer be used with the same impunity as in previous decades. The corridor has introduced a new variable into the strategic equation, and that variable will reshape negotiations, military planning, trade relationships, and economic forecasts for years, and possibly decades to come. The world your children inherit will be shaped in part by corridors like this one, and by the decisions being made right now about which routes to build, which alliances to forge, and which choke points to make obsolete through patient infrastructure investment. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe for our next deep dive. We are already tracking the next major development in this story, and it could fundamentally alter how we think about energy security, global trade, and the balance of power across Eurasia. The world is changing faster than most people realize, and understanding those changes before they become obvious to everyone gives you an edge in navigating an increasingly complex global landscape where the rules are being rewritten and old certainties are dissolving. Stay alert, stay informed, and remember that the most consequential developments often happen quietly, beneath the surface of the daily news cycle, until one day you look up and realize that everything has shifted in ways that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. That day arrived quietly with the completion of a 1,300-kilometer corridor that changed the map of Middle Eastern power and global trade simultaneously. The question now is not whether this matters, because it clearly does. The question is how fast the implications will spread through oil markets, diplomatic negotiations, military planning, and eventually the prices you pay at the pump and the store. Watch closely. The next chapter of this story is already being written.